I'm going to walk you through the very basics of XLConnect and what you need to know to get off the ground and start running with XLConnect right away, some issues you might face along the way. So first of all, you're going to want to install the package XLConnect, and then of course you're going to want to load that package. Now when you load the package, or even when you install it, you might get this error that pops up, and it'll say Java Home or something to that effect, cannot load, or XL jars cannot load, which is a required package. If you get that, it more than likely means that you are not running at the same bitness for your R version as you are for Java. And if that doesn't make any sense, that's fine. All you really have to do is make sure, number one, what version are you running of R. So to do that, you'll go into Tools, Global Options, and you'll go Change. I am running a 32-bit version of R right now. Likely when you installed R, you installed both the 32-bit and the 64-bit because that's the default settings. It will install both onto your machine. I am running the 32-bit version, but you want to go in and make sure you have the same version of R as you do Java. How do you check your version of Java? You simply type Java into your search bar. You'll click Configure Java. Once that opens up, you'll go into Java, View. I'm running x86, which is a 32-bit. It's 32-bitness. So if I were running x64, that would be a 64-bit. So that will let you know if you're running the same bitness, and that's definitely required in order to use XLConnect effectively or possibly at all. The next thing you do want to do, you want to make sure that you have RJava installed. That is required for XLConnect. So you'll click this. I have it installed, obviously nothing popped up there. There were no errors or anything. But if it gives you an error, you want to install it. It might give you that Java Home error again, in which case you're just going to want to make sure that you're running at the same bitness for both R as well as Java. And if you don't have anything pop up when you type in Java, you should have some sort of Java on your machine. But if you don't have like configured Java on your machine, you're probably going to want to go into the Java website, download either the 64-bit or the 32-bit version for your operating system, and then go ahead and get that installed. And then, of course, use the same version of R as you were using for Java. I can't stress that enough. That is very important, or you will never get XLConnect to work. If you have any questions about that, please put it in the comments below. So, on to the actual XLConnect package and sort of how all that works. First of all, you need to get comfortable setting your working directory. I just have a very simple file in here called My File in a folder called XLConnect Lessons. So that's where I'm setting my working directory. Because when I grab my workbook for R to manipulate, I need to tell it where to get that workbook, obviously. So I'm setting the working directory to that folder. And if I go ahead and run that, it sets my working directory there with no problems. Now this next command is where XLConnect comes into play. You'll go ahead and go with load workbook, and load workbook is a function that really just does what it says. And most of these functions are self-explanatory in verbiage. Once we get into the more complicated stuff, it might not be, but this stuff is very clear. So you'll go ahead and type load workbook. You'll put your file, which in my case is myfile.xlsx, and then you'll put create equals false or true or what have you. This function actually has 3 arguments, 2 of which are default. So create is default to false anyway, so I don't even have to put that argument in there. And then there's also a password argument in case your workbook has a password. This is default to null. So this is actually what the default function looks like. File name goes here, and then these don't even have to put in. If I delete those and run load workbook, it will still run it just fine. I want those in just to demonstrate what I'm doing. Now, if I do want to create a new workbook, I can go ahead and press true. If I want to go myfile2, I can go ahead and create equals true. I can set a password if I want to. I can do I can change these arguments however I want to. We'll keep that false for now and stick with my file. And we'll go ahead and run that. Now, when I go into my folder and I click my file, you notice nothing has changed here. So obviously, we're not manipulating the workbook right now as far as what's on our disk or the file in that folder itself. We're not manipulating it quite yet. We'll do that down here when we say save workbook. But right now, we're just manipulating it in R. So what we have to do is save this workbook to a variable. And I just called mine WB, but you could call it orange, you could call it donut, you could call it whatever you wanted to. I think you get the point. You can call it whatever you want to, and it'll store that object in the environment for future reference. So the next function, oh, and before I actually move on to the next function, I do want to mention this. You can only use XLSX or XLS. If you use anything else, it will give you an error. The function cannot handle any other file types. Only XLSX or XLS. For instance, you cannot write a macro file with this. If we try to do that, and I'll have to, let's say I'm creating a new file, and we'll save my file too. Let's say I try to run this. I'm going to get an error, of course, and it's going to say XLS and XLSX are allowed. There are no other file types that are allowed. So keep that in mind. You obviously cannot do that here, so just go ahead and put XLSX. And we'll go ahead and say false there. And we'll run that again just for old time's sake. Okay, so on to the next function. Create sheet. Well, what does this do? Well, I mean, obviously, it creates a sheet. Like I said, these functions are very self-explanatory, and they were meant to be that way. So we'll type in create sheet here, and there are two arguments to create sheet. One, of course, is the workbook name you created up here. And again, this could be anything. It just needs to match what's up here. So again, you could call it orange as long as you put in orange right here. Many of you probably know that after working in R or any programming language for a while, but for people that are new to programming, variable assignment just has to be the same when you reference it in another function. So this workbook does need to be the same name down here as it is up here. We move on to the next argument. That's just the name of our sheet. And it's pretty simple. It's just what is our workbook and what's the name of the sheet. And boom, that'll create a sheet within this. So within that workbook, within R right now. It does nothing to this file yet. Nothing is going on yet in this my file here on the disk. It's only doing anything in R right now. So that's a pretty simple one, and you really won't run into many troubles with this. Just make sure that your sheet is in quotations, that it's a valid sheet name for Excel. I believe, I can't remember the things that Excel can't take, but anything else you can put here in create sheet. If we move on to the next function, write worksheet, this is actually writing to an existing worksheet. So it as opposed to create sheet, which creates an entirely new sheet, write worksheet writes to a sheet that already exists in your workbook. And how we do that is, of course, we have to reference the workbook we're writing to. So that WB again, and again, this could be orange, this could be whatever you wanted, as long as it matches what's up here. Okay, and if we're writing to the same sheet, then we obviously need to keep all of this the same. So we're writing to workbook or WB, and I just use the MT cars data set. The MT cars data set, I can go ahead and run this real quick for you. It's just a very simple built-in R data set that shows some model types, MPG, gear, and so forth. The data set really isn't important. You can write any data frame you want into a worksheet. So we'll go ahead and move to the next argument here, and of course that's the sheet name. And we created the sheet up here. So the sheet doesn't have to have existed in the file beforehand. As long as you created it up here, we can go ahead and reference it down here. And I can show you that. I think I ran this before, obviously, so I have the news sheet in here, and that's kind of the final output. But if I delete that and go ahead and save this, and we run all this, I'm still not going to get any errors. I'm not going to get any problems because this is all being done in R right now. It doesn't care if that news sheet exists in the Excel file or not, which it currently does not, because it exists within the workbook in the R environment. So if we move on to the next argument, we're going to start row 1, start column 1. And obviously these are pretty self-explanatory arguments as well. Start row, just what row do you want to start at on the sheet? Start column, what column do you want to start at on the sheet? It's very simple, but these do default to 1. So essentially we'll overwrite stuff in your workbook. So if you have an existing workbook and you want to write things below an existing data set or something like that, we'll cover kind of how to do that in a variable way in a later video. But for the time being, just understand that these default to 1, so it will start in that A1 cell reference before it moves on to anything else, and it will overwrite anything, as long as this empty cars data set is, which I don't know how many columns or rows this is, but it will write the entire data set into R, into Excel, into that sheet, no matter what is currently in there. So do keep that in mind, but you can start at whatever. We'll go ahead and start at row 2, column 2, just to see what that looks like. Header is really just saying, do you want to include the variable names? So do you want to include MPG, cylinder, display, all that stuff? Do you want to include that? And we'll go ahead and say true on that front. So if we run this, boom, we are done with that. And then we want to save the workbook, and you want to make sure that you haven't changed your working directory in that time. In real world situations, you might flip from one R file to another, and then you forgot that you changed your working directory, and all of a sudden you get an error or something of that nature down here. So that's something to keep in mind when you save workbook. Make sure that it is to the right directory. But we'll save the workbook again. We reference that same variable name that we referenced down here, and boom, done. If we go into the file now, we have that new sheet, starts at row 2, column 2, and this huge data. It's not very huge, actually. It's a pretty small data set, but this data set is in the file now. So obviously, there's just a huge amount of things you can do with this. I've used it a lot in my work to make extremely fast workbooks that would not be possible in a normal format, where you're using some product functions and you're using VLOOKUPs and all this stuff, and it just takes everything from your workbook, and so it's very hard to make really complex user-friendly workbooks when that happens. But with this and a variety of other tools that I'll show you in later videos, you can make workbooks extremely fast and very versatile, so that you are really limiting the calculation time, doing most of it in R, which can generally do calculations much quicker, and getting everything into a workbook that you want to. So it's really a great way to automize the process, mechanize the process, and just make really robust Excel workbooks. So we'll get into all of that later in some future videos. If you do have any questions about what we talked about or encountering any errors with any of these functions, please do let me know.